Chapter 8 Part 2 Topics. Impeachment of Judges. Letters from Charles O'Connor and William Allen Butler. O'Connor's account of the origin of the New York Kings. Seymour's nomination for the presidency. Tilden not responsible for it. Letters to the Tammany Society. Declines an invitation to speak in Washington for the ratification of Seymour's nomination. Honorable Les J. Tilden. While Mr. Tilden was a member of the legislature in 1872, a bill was introduced upon the recommendation of what was then known as the Committee of 70, for the ostensible purpose of reforming the city government, and at the same time putting an end to the Tweed Charter, under which so much mischief had been wrought. Mr. Tilden approved of the main objects which the authors of the bill sought to accomplish, but he could not approve of it in terms, for reasons set forth in a short speech he delivered on a motion to recommend the bill to the Committee on Cities. What he said on the subject of separating municipal from state and national elections, upon home rule for New York, and upon minority representation, still possess undiminished interest and importance. A preliminary question was raised this morning by the gentleman who made this motion as to the validity of the 103rd section, which cuts off the terms of the existing officials. I deem it due to myself and to this House to declare my opinion upon this question. I have this afternoon carefully read the case in the Court of Appeals, which has been referred to. In that case, the officer whose term was extended by an act of the legislature was one whose office was made elective by the Constitution of 1846. The decision was that the term of such an office could not be extended by the legislature, but did not say that the term of such an office could not in a fit case be shortened. That question was not involved in the particular case before us. The officers of a city government come within another provision of the Constitution, which enables the legislative power to act upon them on a different principle. They are to be elected by the people, or to be appointed by local authorities, as the legislature may prescribe. Now, I will venture to say there has never been a case where a new government has been instituted in any of the cities of the state. There has scarcely ever been a case where, in order to put the new government into full and complete organization, it was not necessary to abridge the existing terms of the officers performing the functions of the prior government. I presume in every charter of the city of New York that has been done. I have not the slightest doubt, as a lawyer, that it is competent for this legislative body to shorten these terms for that purpose. I have not the slightest question that this 103rd section of the Act before us is valid, and will be effectual if this Act becomes a law. I could cite in support of that opinion the written conclusion of a lawyer, perhaps the first in the jurisprudence of his country, a man of great learning, a man of noble sense of constitutional honor, and whose opinion is always the result of deliberate, sincere conviction. I mean Charles O'Connor. I happen to know that not very long ago, when a question of this kind arose prior to this present controversy, he gave a written opinion to that effect. Let me say, in regard to the authors of this bill, that I entertain no doubt of the entire good faith and patriotism with which they have labored to prepare this charter, and regret only, as they did me the honor on some occasions to consult me, that I was not so situated as to be able, during the month of December, to give more time to the preparation of a charter, though I do not know whether it would have made any difference in the result which they reached. I was compelled to make one selection as to which branch of the people's service I could devote my time. I submitted the question to the men most eminent and effective in the cause of reform, and they commanded me during the whole of that month for a different service. Thence I am here today less able, perhaps, than I ought to be to discuss these questions. It is due to myself to say that it is not because I have selfishly secluded myself in any personal or private business. In the last 5 months I have not given 5 days to any professional or private business whatsoever. That time has been devoted to the service of that great community in which I always lived. I gave it freely. I gave it ungrudgingly. I wish only that I could have multiplied myself by 4, in order to perform the duties that pressed upon me. In many of the features of this charter I cordially and completely concur. I concur particularly in the plan of making the municipal election a spring election. It was always so until 1849, but some rash empiric in that day thought it would be advisable to combine the April election with the November election, and so began that career of descent which we have unhappily trodden from that time to this. It may seem to you, Mr. Speaker, that I attach more importance to this point than is justly due. But so, why should the government of a great metropolis be controlled by questions of national or state parties, as it always will be if the municipal election is held in November, when the tide of public feeling is so strong that it is impossible that the people should much consider what is right or what is wise in respect to the municipal election? The old system which prevails in the towns and counties of the state, by which the local elections are placed as far as possible from the general elections, that plan is the wisest one, and I am glad to return to it. I advocated it 2 years ago, and may perhaps flatter myself that the impression which I made had something to do with this provision in the proposed charter. I know that it is said that it doubles the expenses of an election, but how small a matter is that compared with the good government of a city. I know that some of our friends have sometimes thought that the majority for state and national officers was increased by having the impulsion coming from a contest in the city government at the same time. But I think that in a large and general sense it will always turn out that what is best for the whole people will be best for any party which happens to be in the majority. I ventured to say several years ago that while we might perhaps get the majority for this year, by and by a time might come when some evil or wrong in the municipal affairs would create a commotion in state and nation. So, the interest of the parties is the interest of the entire people. I believe with a spring election you would have the best advance towards a system of minority representation that can be well devised. There would be apt to be differences of opinion among the members of the party largely in the majority, and there will be a chance for the minority to assert itself. It is not good for any party to hold irresponsible power. Jefferson, the father of democracy, said that democracy was founded not in confidence, but in jealousy and distrust. No man, no set of men, no party ought to be trusted with irresponsible power, for it is one of the calamities of our time that the Republican Party in the interior and the Democratic Party on the seaboard are too strong respectively. If you could distribute the majority so as to make a sharp and active competition in all localities, it would be a great deal better. The slightest undulations of public opinion would have been felt in the elections if the majorities were moderate in every locality. It is for these reasons, sir, that I entirely approve of this provision in regard to a spring election. On the occasion when I was consulted in regard to this charter, I objected to giving the legislative power to a single body. Wherever parliamentary government have been known among our race, we have needed and adopted the checking, restraining, revising power of a second chamber. In all the 37 states of this Union, as well as in the federal government, that principle is adhered to. I do not think there is a publicist of any authority who entertains any doubt on this point. I know it is said that the existence of two bodies in New York has been the cause of a great deal of wrong. Sir, the regulations in regard to bills passing through the Committee of the Whole were devised to prevent hasty legislation. Do they always accomplish that purpose? We know they do not. Shall we now strike off these restraints, or shall we strengthen them? I know it is said further that the city of New York is simply a municipality, and that there are a great many cities that do not have two chambers. Sir, New York City is no longer a village. The executive officer of New York City is the governor of 1 million of people, and experience has shown that the interests of that large community are so various and conflicting that it needs all the check and balance of parliamentary government. There is not a government under the sun where every security is more requisite than New York City. I, therefore, advise my friends of the Committee of 70 that they ought not to attempt any innovation here. In the first place, I told them that it presented a grave constitutional objection. The first form in which anything of the sort was presented to the public was the system, which was called limited voting, voting for one man and having two elected. I ventured on the earliest occasion when that scheme was presented to foretell a disaster. I thought I had observed enough of the practical workings of politics to see that that was tantamount to putting all the power in the hands of the caucuses. What is the use of scratching when the men on both sides are elected anyhow? It is now generally agreed that that system is a total failure. After having devoted a great deal of time during my life to the reading of subjects of this character, and to thought upon them, it having been rather a favorite mode of occupying my leisure, I find myself unable to foresee exactly what is going to happen from this system. In the convention of 1867 it was proposed that to a very limited extent we should adopt it in the election of the judges of the Court of Appeals. I thought it might do for one occasion, when men were not tempted and had not learned the methods on which abuses could be successfully practiced under it. We carried it out in the election of the judges without any great inconvenience. I took the greatest pains to induce the leading Democratic lawyers to attend the convention to make the best nominations. I appealed by 2,000 circulars to all the lawyers of the country. They responded, and the result was favorable. But even then we had some very eccentric results. There was something of a scramble, of course, as to who should run highest on each ticket. As a citizen and a lawyer, trained to better standards, Mr. Tilden had seen the descent of the bench and bar with deep regret. He had often felt that those at the bar who, like himself, had ceased to be dependent for a livelihood upon professional earnings, ought to feel themselves under a providential call to open to the younger members of the profession a better future than that which seemed to be closing in upon him. A future in which personal and professional honor would not be incompatible with pecuniary success. It came to his knowledge during the session that a large fund was raising for the corruption of the committee charged with the impeachment of the accused judges. If spent, it proved unsuccessful. The impeachment was carried. But even then an effort, which came near being successful, was made to defeat the ends of justice in the choice of managers. Here again the fortune of the day was saved by a proposition of Mr. Tilden, which was adopted, by which the selection of counsel for the prosecution was to be satisfactory to the Bar Association. The prosecution of these impeachments, the conduct of the suits which have been commenced on behalf of the city, the gathering of the fruits of the various investigations he had made or instituted, occupied him most of the ensuing summer. The results were the arrest, imprisonment, or flight of all the parties who, only a few years before, seemed to hold the wealth and power of the Empire State in the hollow of their hands. The Bar of New York, encouraged by Tilden's example, energy, and courage, cooperated with him in his efforts in a way as creditable to its members as to him, and to an extent of which its history furnished no precedent. It is only a grave necessity and a stem sense of duty that can justify a lawyer in jeoparding the interests of his clients by administering to any judicial officer of a court in which he practices a public censure, and it is a flattering evidence of the confidence of his brethren, not only in the motives of Mr. Tilden, but in his extraordinary resources for accomplishing the task he had undertaken, and in his ability to develop a rebellion into a revolution, that through the whole of the sanguine and desperate controversy they stood by and sustained him whenever, and to whatever extent their aid was invoked. That he enjoyed and appreciated this support, he neglected no suitable opportunity of confessing. When the struggle was nearing its triumphant close in the spring of 1872, he was invited to preside at an adjourned meeting of the Bar Association of New York City. His remarks on taking the chair belong to the history of this the first, if not the only, successful attempt to impeach any member of the New York judiciary. Gentlemen, I congratulate you on the substantial progress which has been made in purifying the judiciary. Everything which at the beginning of the late legislative session you set before yourselves as practicable, everything which you were afterward encouraged to undertake, has been accomplished. You asked for an inquiry into abuses in the administration of justice. You have had an investigation, patient and thorough, during 7 weeks, in sessions continued from 10 in the morning until late at night, carried on in the presence of the accused and their counsel. It is true the inquiry could only touch a small part of the evils, the specific cases presented by you. But every judge against whom you made charges has been put on his trial, except one who fled from the ordeal. I repeat to you tonight what I said at the meeting at which this association was organized. It was on February 1, 1870, when the shameful perversions of judicial process and judicial power that characterized 1869 were fresh in the public mind, and the corrupt oligarchy whose tools these judges were seemed to sit enthroned over the prostrate people of our metropolis. If it will do its duty to itself, the bar can do everything else. It can have reformed constitutions, it can have a reformed judiciary, it can have the administration of justice made pure and honorable. One word as to the pending impeachment of Judge Barnard. I do not share the fears which have been expressed in the public journals as to the result. First, I know that in the investigation which extended to all the witnesses the accused desired to produce, and with full cross-examinations, there was developed more impeachable matter, 10 times over, than can be found in the 8 principal cases of judicial impeachment, 4 resulting in convictions, which have occurred in this country. Secondly, I believe that the leading members of the Committee of Managers will faithfully prosecute the trial. Thirdly, I have the most absolute confidence in the abilities, professional skill, and earnest patriotism of the counsel who will represent the people, and on whom the real burden of the trial will fall. I respect the sentiments of my brethren of the bar which demanded that I should continue still further my connection with the movement to purify the judiciary. I mean, of course, as one of the managers of the impeachment, for you all know that I would not have acted as counsel, while I did not feel at liberty, by my own act, to withhold any service which you thought I could render to the great reform. My opinion differs somewhat from the public impression. The great work of investigation, of collecting evidence, and of securing sufficient concurrence and cooperation to put the accused on trial, which has been an immense and difficult labor, is done. The gentlemen whom I met in conference after everything had been completed except to decide on the form of procedure, when I consented to impeachment instead of removal by concurrent resolution, and I see several of those gentlemen present, will remember that I then stated my difficulty in engaging in a prolonged trial during the summer. When the choice of the managers came to be made, I did not feel called on to enter into a canvass or to form combinations. In everything else I had felt it my duty to exercise all foresight, and every care, and devote whatever power I possessed to organize such elements as could be found for good ends. In this I felt entitled to leave every human being in the assembly to his spontaneous action. If I should receive an honorable discharge, I had a right to accept it. I cannot be accused of selfishness if I did so with delight. One care only remained for me. That was, to look after the choice of counsel. I communicated what seemed to be, in the actual circumstances, the best suggestions to Mr. Alvord, and met his prompt and cordial concurrence. Of Mr. Van Cott, the senior member of the committee which represented you in the investigations, I need not speak. The eminent jurist with whom he will be associated, Judge Comstock, will bring to his duty great abilities, ample stores of learning, and an honorable pride in restoring the renown of the bench and the bar of the state. I remember with what solemn earnestness he said to me several years ago, that we could never reform the judiciary of this district until we had first crushed the corrupt power which stood behind it. I do not see that justice will be more likely to fail, that the trial is to be conducted in the light of open day, with the eager scrutiny of the bar of the state and country, and under the eyes of a watchful, apprehensive, and somewhat distrusting people. While what has been done toward purifying the judiciary is just cause of congratulation, you will appreciate the difficulties through which it has been obtained, if you reflect that everything else in the way of reform has failed. It is known to you that when I consented to go to the Assembly it was with a view to the judicial reform, and to certain other measures more particularly interesting the people of the city, and that in that work I expected the cooperation in the legislature of Mr. O'Connor and Mr. Evarts. This arrangement was defeated by subsequent events. I believed that it was necessary to concentrate myself upon a very few measures in order to accomplish anything. The general demoralization growing out of the Civil War and paper money had produced widespread effects. The corrupt power which had just been overthrown in the city had its origin in a partnership of plunder between men nominally of different politics, but, in fact, of no politics at all, and had established extensive affiliations throughout the state in both parties and in both branches of the dominant party, which now possessed 3/4 of the legislature. It had been necessary to the system that the capital should be surrounded by an atmosphere of corruption. The ambition of some had been tempted. The interests of more had been addressed by making legislative business profitable, and the golden showers had sprinkled benefits in every direction. Some, even, who would not take an actual part in the Saturnalia, were content to be silent spectators or consenting witnesses. I never for a moment supposed that the knife and the cautery would be agreeable remedies, or that the silent partners of prosperous criminals would fall in love with those whose duty it is to detect and to punish. I know, therefore, that obstructions, under every pretext, were to be met at every step, and to be overcome. Let us thankfully accept what has been accomplished, and let us here, tonight, renew our faith that if the bar of this city and state will be united and persistent, every judicial reform in respect to men and in respect to systems will be at last successfully achieved. Mr. Tilden concluded with a stirring allusion to the young men at the bar, for whose sake especially he said he had been willing to undertake the arduous labors through which he had just passed, in order that they who came after him might find in their profession a career and renown worthy of their talents. For 16 months Mr. Tilden had been withdrawn entirely from his private business, and had consecrated all his energies and talents, and not a little money, to the public service. The total surrender of my professional business during that period, he has said in one of his published communications, the nearly absolute withdrawal of attention from my private affairs and from all enterprises, in which I am interested, have cost me a loss of actual income, which, with expenditures and contributions the contest has required, would be a respectable endowment of a public charity. I do not speak of these things, he adds, to regret them. In my opinion, no instrumentality in human society is so potential in its influence on the well-being of mankind as the governmental machinery which administers justice and makes and executes laws. No benefaction of private benevolence could be so fruitful in benefits as the rescue of this machinery from the perversion which had made it a means of conspiracy, fraud, and crime against the rights and the most sacred interests of a great community. Economy in the government. This is impossible under a system which, with its cognate systems, annually consumes a sum nearly equivalent to all the net earnings of labor and all the net income of capital in our country, and which in a time of peace maintaining martial law over 1/2 the Republic devotes $11 millions a month to the support of a standing army, in addition to the pensions, to the cost of the Navy, to the outlay on the public debt, and to the general expenses of a civil administration requiring an official force, such as in former and happier times Americans were wont to regard as the exclusive curse and calamity of the military and despotic monarchies of Europe. The people of this country are too intelligent to expect either justice to themselves or economy in the government from the chosen and willing military agent or congressional usurpation. The American army, whose history and whose achievements are the nation's pride and boast, has been endeared to the nation's heart, not as the sword of power, but as the shield of the people. The head of that army today has done injustice to its gallant past by accepting from a usurping Congress functions expressly conferred by the Constitution upon the highest civil magistracy of the nation. The American people, and the soldiers of America who are also the citizens of America, will have no such leader in the work of reconstituting civil liberty throughout this country. They demand a leader who shall represent their deliberate attachment to the principles of free government, their deliberate resolve to see those principles vindicated and maintained, their deliberate purpose to effect a thorough and sweeping change in the existing condition of public affairs. Such a leader we now set before them. The nominations which you are about to ratify represent the final, harmonious judgment of the first truly national convention held in this country for 8 years past. They attest alike the voice of the Great North, demanding justice, economy, and the Constitution, and the voice of the South, accepting fully and in good faith our indissoluble union with all its obligations, hopes, and duties. The Democratic Party, in whose name that convention assembled, invite all who think with us the same things concerning our common country to rally around our standards as equals, friends, and brothers. In this great contest we shall wage no war of defense. We carry our arms into Africa. And, speaking from an experience of more than 30 years in political observation and political action, I do not hesitate to say that in no presidential conflict since the days of Andrew Jackson have omens of victory to any party or any cause been so clear, so numerous, and so inspiring as those which now cheer the party of the national democracy to battle in the cause of American liberty. With much respect, truly yours, S. J. Tilden. End of Chapter 8 Part 2. Author John Bigelow included letters exchanged between Tilden and others after the Tweed takedown. When Mr. Tilden thus wrote, he had not then experienced, nor probably foreseen, the legal consummation of his labors in the condemnation of Tweed and several of his confederates to the striped jacket and cell of a felon, nor the recovery of verdicts which were destined to restore to the city many millions of his ill-gotten plunder, still less the flattering consummation of his labors in the political triumph of his friends, and his own elevation to the governorship of the state in 1874, nor his selection 2 years later as their favorite candidate for the chief magistracy of the Union. Dear Sir, I am sorry that you published this. The attorneys who prosecuted the ring thieves in New York have been heard from. Tremaine and Peckham charged the city $7,500 fees. O'Connor gave his services gratuitously. The latter is a Democrat. Tremaine was a Democrat until the war fever took hold of him. It destroyed the health of many others. Tilden was a war Democrat, and yet believes he was right. Tilden did more than anyone else in this matter. Neither he nor I charge, to be sure. But this is only because we had both retired from practice, and it would have injured the cause if we had made any money by it. But we are both most anxious that no discrimination be made to the disadvantage of others on that account. It would be very unjust so to discriminate. No one who knew all the facts and was a fair-minded thinker would do it. Peckham is the very staunchest kind of a thoroughgoing Democrat. His father was before him the gentleman recently lost in the Ville du Havre. Peckham has done 10 times as much work as anyone else. He has been on hand, at all hours, toiling like a slave. He is a young man, being about half my age. And, in his position, I certainly would have charged and taken, if I could, more than has been awarded to him. The fee you name is the whole legislative appropriation. Some of it remains, and what is spent has not all gone to council. Other very large expenses were incurred. I know that they were all quite necessary, being bound to examine all claims and required to concur in all allowances. Yours truly, Charles O'Connor. New York, March 30, 1874. 4th of April, 1870. When a revised charter for New York was under consideration. After referring briefly to the history of the system of governing New York from Albany by commissions, he proceeds. Without referring further to that subject than I now do, I shall allude to what was the real, strong, governing objection to the system of commissions. It was that the ordinary powers of government were seized hold of by the party then dominant in Albany in the state government, and that New York, in its local affairs, was governed by the state, and not by its own people. No doubt there had been evils and abuses that led to that state of things. It is almost always the case that when usurpations of power or perversions of power arise, that some public evil is pleaded as the ground and excuse. Now, sir, what I want is self-government for the people of the city of New York to the largest practicable extent, and the criticism which, it strikes me, this bill is in some degree subject to is this, that by the first appointment of these various officers, self-government in the people of the city of New York is in abeyance for from 4 to 8 terms go beyond his term, and he has not the power to remove them, nor the power to enforce any practical responsibility as against them. He is a mere cipher. Then, so, at the end of 2 years another election takes place, another mayor is elected. Still these officers extend their terms clear beyond his, the shortest of them being for 4 years, and the longest of them for 8 years, many of them for 5. So, I say in all kindness and deference, this is not self-government for the next 5 years. It is a government in which the people will have no voice, none whatever, for that long period. The act proceeds in the same way which the acts creating commissions have done. A gentleman is designated who makes these appointments. To all practical intents and purposes they are commissions just as under the old system. Now, so, I think this ought to be remedied. The following letter addressed to Mr. Tilden by William Allen Butler, Esq., the President of the Bar Association of New York, and a Republican, gives an individual estimate of Mr. Tilden's services in battling with the Tweed conspiracy, which reflected very fairly the feelings, not only of the bar, but of the general public. William Allen Butler to Samuel J. Tilden. My dear Mr. Tilden, I seize a moment afforded by the leisure of Thanksgiving Day to say to you how often the thought has been in my mind, and how much satisfaction I take in giving it expression, that to you more directly than to any one else are we all indebted for the signal triumph of justice which has just been achieved. Naturally, the most prominent feature in the eye of the public at this moment, when the law is being enforced by its penalties, is that of the judge who administers it. But in the very act of the sentence of Tweed, in years, so, by that bill the appointment of all these officers is to be made by a gentleman now in office. It is precisely as if in the bill it had read, not that the mayor shall make these appointments, but the individual who today fills that office. On the 31st of December, by the provisions of this bill, the term of office will expire. Then, so, what will be the situation of his successor? For 2 years he will have no power whatever over the administration of the government of which he is the nominal head. All these functionaries survive him. Properly calls the attention of all to the fact that this most righteous consummation crowned your work. Old friendships are often interrupted by circumstances and the diverging lines of duty, but they are not destroyed, and it may not be unacceptable to you to know that your part in all this struggle and success is appreciated and borne in grateful remembrance by those who best know the qualities of head and heart which have enabled you to render the state such signal service. Very truly yours, William Allen Butler. More historical correspondence and speeches edited by John Bigelow LLD were separately published in 1908. The volumes titled Letters and Literary Memorials of Samuel J. Tilden is a series about American history and culture in the 19th century. These books can be found in libraries or purchased at online outlets. Conclusion of Chapter 8 Part 2.